Gender theory and non-binary madness. Finally, someone in academia has stood up and said, enough is enough. Or in the original Klingon, marry up! Kira Davis at Red State is our Sherpa for this particular story. A professor at the University of Toronto is under fire this week for announcing to his students he would not submit to their demands for non-binary terms in the classroom. The popular professor has made a video series explaining why he refuses to use non-gender terms for his students. His explanation is as basic as one might think. These are not scientific terms based on scientific research or data. These are the whim of a culture that has been allowed to stomp its feet for far too long. Give a listen, give a look, take notes, and we'll be back after it's completed.
So I've been informed about a couple of things this week that have really been bothering me. And I thought that I wasn't sure what to do about it. I've been communicating with some of my friends and colleagues about it, but that wasn't enough. So I thought I'd try to write my thoughts down and then talk about them a little bit and see where I got with that. So I've entitled this talk Professor Against Political Correctness. And the reason for that is because it's blunt and to the point. I'm very concerned about what's happening in the universities. It's not so bad in Canada. I've been fortunate, very fortunate at the University of Toronto, but there are continually things happening, including in the administration here and in the broader political world, that make me very nervous. I like to attribute that to the fact that I know something about the way that totalitarian and authoritarian political states develop, and I can't help but think that I'm seeing a fair bit of that right now. So I guess I also wanted to do this because there's a misapprehension that everyone in academia is politically correct, and that is true very frequently among social scientists, about 20% of whom identify themselves as Marxists, which in my estimation, by the way, is no better than identifying as Nazis, given the murderousness of the Marxist doctrine and the fact that we know how it's turned out when implemented in multiple countries now. But I'm not politically correct, and I want to talk to you today about why all this worries me. So I got wind of two events this week. One actually dates from last May. There was a legislation passed, or the first reading of legislation in the federal house in Canada about a bill called C-16, which is an attempt to alter the Canadian Bill of Human Rights. It's tangled up with another organization that operates at a provincial level in Canada, in Ontario, which is the province I reside in, called the Ontario Human Rights Commission. And as far as I can tell, what happens at the Ontario Human Rights Commission is rapidly turned into policy in multiple provinces across Canada, and perhaps increasingly at the federal level. There's a Liberal government in power. That's the name of the political party in Ontario, and now there's a Liberal government federally, and there's obviously a fair bit of cross-influence, for better or for worse. Also this week I got wind of a University of Toronto human resources initiative that also upset me, I guess we could say, quite profoundly. And so I thought I'd talk about all of those and try to see if I could make some sense out of them. So I'm making this video because I don't really know what else to do. I've talked to some colleagues, and I've talked to some colleagues some people inside the university and outside the university that I know, and they're upset and worried about this, but unclear about what to do. And all of this scares me, I guess, and here's why. The changes to the law scare me because they put into the legal substructure of the culture certain assumptions about basic human nature that not only do I believe to be untrue, I think they're also dangerous and ideologically motivated. I also don't think that the reason for the legal changes is the stated reason. The laws scare me. The doctrines behind the laws scare me. And, when there's a law, there's a body of thought that's associated with it, a body of interpretations that are associated with it that flesh out the law, because the law is a pretty bare thing. And I've read, I wouldn't say extensively, because extensively is a lot, but I've read enough about the doctrines behind the laws so that has also makes me very nervous. Increasingly, I see that these more radical ideas, the ideas that we're going to discuss, are bought in. People buy in at the administrative level in large organizations, corporate, governmental. It doesn't matter. As long as the organization is large, there's increasing administrative buy-in. A lot of this seems to me to be driven by human resources departments, which I think are generally the most pathological elements of large organizations. And I say that because I've actually had fairly extensive experience dealing with human resources departments. I think HR training is very politically correct, like many disciplines. We'll talk about that later. The people behind the doctrines also scare me. I think that generally they're a very bad combination of resentful, uninformed, and that's good enough. Resentful and uninformed, that's good enough. I also think that their aims are destructive rather than constructive. They claim constructive aims, but of course everyone claims constructive aims. But the actions that I see undertaken seem to be driven by resentment, and primarily by resentment. And so I doubt the validity of the claims. The claims are always for equality and diversity and that kind of thing. And those words are very easy to say, but a lot harder to put into practice. So I'm scared by the people behind the doctrines. I'm scared by the response of my colleagues at the university. A number of them are unnerved by the continual move towards political correctness, and I'm going to tell you a couple of responses that I've got recently from people that I think are quite brave, by the way, but worried about making a statement, putting their careers on their line, worried about being tortured to death by people online, worried about administrative over-response or even administrative response, worried, well, here's why. The things that I'm seeing at work will have to be discussed in a phone conversation. This is a professor, an American professor. I asked how this person was feeling about the position that they held at the university. The person said, the thing that I'm seeing at work will have to be discussed in a phone conversation. It's hard for me personally to explain it in an email. I'm not certain this is the career path I'm interested in anymore. I actually find myself censoring things that I'd normally say to students, and I'm not sure how to stop that self-censorship. The censorship leads to me not truly educating them in a manner that will let me feel like I've done my job well. It's not as much from the administration yet as it is from the students. See, I don't see that so much at the University of Toronto. The students here are so terrified of the job market and generally speaking so diligent and conscientious that they are not particularly sidetracked by political correctness. So, but that's obviously not my colleague's experience in the US. This is in California. Another colleague, this is more local, said something I thought was very intelligent, and I think that's why this sort of thing is so difficult to stand up to. The personal consequences of objecting are huge, and this person is referring to the possibility of adverse job effects, I guess effects on employment. And you'd think tenure would protect people against that, and I suppose it probably does, but that doesn't mean that people are necessarily willing to put it to the test. And they're worried about being pilloried online by social justice warriors and so on, and having their reputation savaged and demolished. So, and that's a reasonable fear, especially given the next part, which is the effect of my objection on society will be minuscule. So there's this combination. That's the idea, anyways. The personal consequences of objecting are potentially huge, and the social effects are minuscule. There'll be no positive effect. And so the thinking goes, why put yourself and potentially your family and your financial stability and all of that at risk by speaking out when the consequences will be minimal? And I've talked to other people outside of academia, writers, for example, who've had friends who've made a comment online, which they thought was rather innocuous, that's quoted over and over again, and sometimes in major newspapers as emblematic of their particular stance, and that shows them in a very harsh light. So, anyways, this particular colleague concluded by saying we should have acted 10 years ago. Well, I feel for both of these colleagues, I think they're both excellent educators, by the way, and they're also, I would say, classically liberal people. They're not. You wouldn't call them conservatives. You certainly wouldn't call them right wingers. They're people. Their concerns aren't driven by their political ideologies. It's as simple as that. Their concerns are driven by their continual observations, increasingly continual observations that things are not going in the proper direction in universities, and that it's becoming increasingly difficult for professors and students, for that matter, at least of a particular kind of political orientation, to even have the opportunity to say what they think. So, okay, so that scares me. It scares me when I see decent people, and I think people who are more courageous than average, frightened into submission and considering altering their career paths because they don't feel that they can say what they think anymore, and they're afraid of the direction that the universities are going. So, yeah, that's scary. So then I'm a clinical psychologist. This is starting to affect my clients. I've had 3 clients in the last 2 years who have been who have been driven near the point of insanity by politically correct occurrences at work. One of them was a bank employee. What finally did her in fundamentally was she sent me a very long email chain referring to a series of discussions that happened in this bank internally about whether or not the word flip chart, referring to those large pads of paper that you put up on a stand that you can flip forward and draw on, kind of an archaic technology now, whether or not the word flip chart was pejorative and racist. And the reason for that was that apparently the word flip can be used pejoratively to refer to Filipinos, which was something I didn't even know, and I suppose a Filipino could conceivably take offense to having a pad of paper named flip chart, although it's hard to imagine the circumstances under which that might arise, or at least once it was hard to imagine that. Anyways, she gave me access to a string of email conversations about that particular topic, and the bank did eventually agree to stop using the term flip chart. I don't know what they replaced it with, but she was a very, very sensible person, an immigrant, by the way, who couldn't reconcile her requirement, her moral requirement to work hard and be productive and be sensible and be conscientious with the fact that people were being called on to alter their behavior in ways that were absolutely nonsensical. And she was from an Eastern European country, and of course for her this was reminiscent of the tactics of the worst of the ideologues in the 1970s and 80s and before that. So it was very, very hard on her. She was very, very stressed by the situation at work. And then I had another client who worked in an HR department in a major educational institute, and he was always being called on to manifest his support for various feminist initiatives at the educational institute, and he wasn't really all that comfortable presenting himself as a pro-feminist because he actually wasn't one. And you can argue one way or another about the propriety of that, and that's really not my point. My point is that he believed, and I think with cause, that his job would have been in jeopardy if he would have let his objections to the demands of the political environment within the workplace, if he would have made those objections known. And I would say he's a little bit more to the right than most of the people that I've talked with, but not to any great degree. Although, like many people, I think he's being driven in that direction by the continual radical moves to the left that seem to be part and parcel of every organization in maybe in modern Western society now. And then the other client that I had who was very much troubled by this was a social worker who was I think she was an immigrant as well, quite conservative. She was from a conservative culture, and was very much had very much difficulty with the demands, for example, that she allow non-surgically altered transsexual men free access to the women's shelters. And the women's shelters, for example, here are some of the people in them obviously say are Muslim women who come from very conservative cultures, who really can't even function in a situation where, you know, a male, biological male, has been given access to what in principle is supposed to be a woman's shelter. And that was one of many things that bothered her. But we don't need to get into that. The point is that I've had people who've been driven to seek psychological counseling because of the effect of politically correct oppression on them in the workplace. And so that's worrisome. So that's a whole bunch of things that make me nervous. And then my own response scares me. I find this stuff maddening. I can't really believe the amount of foolishness that has accumulated around these rather contentious Marxist, semi-Marxist political issues, which I have no respect for. As I said already, I think that Marxism and neo-Marxism is no better than fascism and neo-fascism. I think the historical evidence for that is absolutely clear. I can't understand why we think it's acceptable for academics and their followers to call themselves Marxists and neo-Marxists, but we would not for a second countenance the same thing from the fascists and the neo-fascists. Anyways, the upshot of it is that I'm nervous about doing this lecture, and I've also become nervous about some of the things that I'm teaching, which I think, and I'm going to discuss this a little bit further on in this discussion. I think that some of the things that I say in my lectures now might be illegal. I think that they might even be sufficient for me to be brought before the Ontario Human Rights Commission under their amended hate speech laws. And that scares me as well. And it scares me that I think that, because it sounds paranoid, but most of the time in the past, when I've been concerned that something is going to happen at an administrative or bureaucratic level at the university, that it's frequently the case that when I'm worried about something happening, that it does actually happen, and that it's not so much worry as an ability to see high probability outcomes down into the future. So, and you know, even if the things that I'm saying haven't been made illegal, or, you know, heaven forbid, transformed suddenly into hate speech, I am nervous that they might be, and even that's making it more difficult for me to teach, because in order for me to teach, I have to say what I think is true, and I can't do that if I have to be afraid of the consequences. I'll stop talking, you know, if you can say one thing or the other, and there's a lot of pressure not to say the first thing, and you could just as easily say the second thing, it's just as easy to say the second thing. Why not just not bother with it? Well, the reason I can't do that is because if I have something to say and I don't say it, then it drives me crazy. And that's not something I'm not willing to go down that path. And I've already decided that I'm going to try to tell people what I think, and to tell them what I think to be the truth, even though it's the truth that I think that. I'm not saying that what I think is true. I mean, who knows what's true? That's why we have freedom of speech, right? To sort out what's true. But I can tell you that it's true that I'm scared about this. And I think that's appalling. I really think that's appalling. All right, so this is Bill C-16, and somebody sent this to me this week, and pointing out what was happening with regards to this fundamental Canadian human rights legislation. And I'm going to do a bad job of this because it takes more time than I have to do this properly. So all I can do is tell you my initial thoughts and try to justify them as best I can. It would take months to do this lecture properly, and I haven't got months to do it properly, so I'm going to have to do it badly. So here we go. So Bill C-16 is an act to amend the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code. So this is a major amendment, because the Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code are major pieces of legislation. They affect everyone, and the consequences for contravening them are severe as severe consequences can be, short of, of illness and death. So they're non-trivial pieces of legislation. Now, if you guys aren't in Canada, you might wonder why you should care about this, but what's happening in Canada is happening throughout the West. So I'm going to concentrate on the local occurrences, but you can be sure they're emblematic of similar things happening in your jurisdictions. So, because this is certainly not only a Canadian problem, and in fact, I would say to some fairly large degree, Canada has been reasonably free of this, especially at the university level, and it's almost as if we're importing it unnecessarily. But okay, this enactment amends the Canadian Human Rights Act to add gender identity and gender expression to the list of prohibited grounds of discrimination. Now, this amendment has only gone through first reading. This was back in May, but similar legislation has already been passed in a number of provinces. Those are the smaller, they're like states. They're the smaller subdivisions of the Canadian political system. So this hasn't been made into law federally, but it's likely going to, and it already has at the provincial level, as I said. So this enactment also amends the Criminal Code to extend the protection against hate propaganda set out in that act to any section of the public that is distinguished by gender identity or expression, and to clearly set out that evidence that an offense was motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on gender identity or expression constitutes an aggravating circumstance that a court must take into consideration when it imposes a sentence. Okay, so that's basically a hate crime modification. So if you commit a crime, well, that's one thing. But if you commit a crime and it's motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on age, sex, race, ethnic identity, and and other things, including now gender identity or expression, then that makes the crime worse. It falls into the category of hate crime. And so that's what this modification is intended to produce or to bring about. So any crime that is associated with bias, prejudice, or hate based on gender identity or expression is now an aggravating circumstance. Okay, so it's a hate crime. Now, I have some real problems with hate speech legislation, and the reason I have problems with it is that it's not obvious when speech is motivated by hate. Angry speech can feel like it's motivated by hate. But angry speech is the only kind of speech, in some sense, that is indicative of real disagreement. I mean, I'm not saying that all disagreement should be angry. I'm just saying that if there is real disagreement, anger is often the evidence for the existence of real disagreement. And if there's real disagreement, angry people have to talk it out. Because if they don't, then well, then a bunch of terrible things happen. First of all, you start losing track of who the angry people are. Second, they don't get to say what's on their mind and even listen to themselves. They don't get to have other people tell them that they're wrong. They don't get to modify their viewpoints. Because talking is thinking, and if you stop people from talking, then you stop them from thinking, and that's a really bad thing. And then if you interpret hate speech too broadly, then you drive the so-called haters underground, and then you don't know what they're up to. And when people go underground, that isn't good. That's really not good. You get the rise of all sorts of underground political movements when people aren't able to express what they think, even though it's unpleasant. So if you want to know where the haters are, then you have to let them talk. And we even tell 2-year-olds who are angry, we say, well, use your words. And the reason we tell 2-year-olds that is because the alternative to using your words is using your fists. And so if we don't let angry people talk, then they only have two alternatives. Well, apart from changing their mind, and they're not going to change their mind just if you just shut someone up. That doesn't change their mind, because partly the way you change your mind is by talking and thinking and communicating with other people. And if you shut that avenue off for people, then they can't change their minds. Well, then they pull it in and get resentful. That's one option. They don't take any action, or they get aggressive and violent, or they start agitating for violence. And so, I can't help but think that there's a famous psychoanalytic dictum. If you don't understand the motivation for something, look at the outcome and infer the motivation. Well, if the outcome of shutting people up is that they get violent, then it's hard for me to suppress the suspicion that it was the incitement of violence that was at least part of the initial motivation for producing the restriction. Now, I think there's a lot more to it than that. I think a lot of this desire for people not to ever say anything upsetting is actually a consequence of trait agreeableness, which is a big 5 psychological trait. And really agreeable people are egalitarian by nature, but they also don't like conflict. But what that means is they don't like short-term conflict. They don't like anybody to be upset. And the problem is sometimes you have to be upset in the present to solve problems in the medium and the long term. You can't stop people from talking about upsetting things, because, as I said, that's just the same as stopping them from thinking. And if they can't think really complicated things through, well, then they don't solve problems, and then the problems manifest themselves in the real world. It's no joke. So there's a recent case, Lionel Shriver, who's a well, I won't talk about her. You can look her up. I'll try to stick to the point here. So this is also part of Bill C-16. This is modification of Section 2 of the Canadian Human Rights Act. Purpose. The purpose of this act is to extend the laws in Canada to give effect, within the purview of matters coming within the legislative authority of Parliament, that's Canada's highest governing body, the principle that all individuals should have an opportunity equal with other individuals to make for themselves the lives that they are able and wish to have, and to have their needs accommodated, consistent with their duties and obligations as members of society, without being hindered in or prevented from doing so by discriminatory practices based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, age, sex, sexual orientation, and now, hypothetically, gender identity or expression, marital status, family status, disability, or conviction for an offense for which a pardon has been granted, or in respect of which a record suspension has been ordered. Okay, so, what's problematic about this? Well, I've outlined some of it in yellow. I don't really like the idea of wish to have, the lives that they're able and wish to have, and then to have their needs accommodated. Well, it's messy terminology. It's not easy to delineate needs. There's an infinite number of them. It's very, very difficult to determine whose needs should take priority. In fact, that's why we have a free market society. We have a free market society so that people's needs can be voted on, in some sense, by the purchasing power of free individuals, so that nobody, no central committee, no governing body has to decide whose needs should be accommodated. It's an infinitely complex problem, and it can't be solved by fiat. It's not possible. And this was happened in places like this was attempted in places like the Soviet Union, where need decisions were constantly made by centralized committees, and the consequence was absolutely catastrophic. Not only was it economically suicidal, it was also murderous. So the whole idea of having needs accommodated is a very, very slippery idea, and it sounds good, but it's very, very dangerous. It's dangerous because the question, who decides whose needs are paramount, is the crucial question. And how that's answered is the crucial issue. And that can go seriously wrong. And then, well, the inclusion of gender identity or expression, well, we'll discuss that momentarily. And there's also modification of Section 3. For all purposes of this act, the prohibited grounds of discrimination are race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, age, sex, sexual orientation, and then again, newly, gender identity or expression, marital status, family status. So this is the criminal code modification of subsection 318.4, where they define an identifiable group, and this is for the purpose of determining who fundamentally is uttering hate speech or discriminatory speech. And this includes all the candidates we already described, color, race, religion, national, ethnic origin, etc., and includes gender identity or expression. And so, well, we'll continue to talk about that. And then there's modifications of subparagraph 718.2a. Again, with regards to hate crime, evidence that the offense was motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on race, national or ethnic origin, language, color, religion, etc., including gender identity or expression or any other similar factor. The offense was motivated by. Okay, so this sort of legislation has already come into play in provinces in Canada, Alberta, British Columbia, Newfoundland and Labrador, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Ontario. And I'm going to concentrate on Ontario because I think a lot of this is emanating from a small coterie of people behind the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which is a particularly pathological organization in my estimation, and perhaps the biggest enemy of freedom currently extant in Canada. And I don't say that lightly. So the reason I think the Ontario Human Rights Commission is an emblematic institution in this regard is partly because I think that that social justice warrior type activists are overrepresented in the current provincial government, or the current Liberal provincial government, and I can't help but manifest the suspicion that that's partly because our current premier is lesbian in her sexual preference, and that in and itself doesn't bother me one way or another. I don't think it's relevant to the political discussion, except insofar as the LBGT community has become extraordinarily good at organizing themselves and has a fairly pronounced and very, very sophisticated radical fringe. And I can't help but see the hand of that in what I'm going to read to you, and you can make up your own mind and see if you think the same thing. So the wording on the Ontario Human Rights Commission with regards to legislation like Bill C-16 is the same. It's identical to that on the Canadian Department of Justice. I've given you the links here. And so that's another indication to me that there's tremendous crosstalk between these institutions, one at the provincial level, that's the Ontario one, and one at the federal level, because the wording is identical. So that's the argument for overlap. And the other thing, too, with regards to the LBGT angle on this is that the wording is identical in many regards to that's commonly used by LBGT activists. And so that's why I'm putting the different organizations together. And as I said before, I'm not saying this is right. It's what I've been able to sort out. It's what I've been able to puzzle out. And I'm putting it forward as an element of discussion. Okay, so here are some of the definitions that they use. And these are now explicit categories and implicit presumptions of our most fundamental legal structures. So now these definitions have become something more than fact. They've become facts that you question at your legal peril. So here's the first one. Gender identity. This is directly from the Ontario Human Rights Commission website. Gender identity is each person's internal and individual experience of gender. It is their sense of being a woman, a man, both, neither, or anywhere along the gender spectrum. Now, I'd also like to point out that this is a petty thing to say, I suppose, but one of the things that struck me about the Ontario Human Rights Commission website is that it's very poorly written. And this particular sentence is very poorly written. And policy that's on its way to be transformed into legislation should not be poorly written, because it means it's been poorly thought through and poorly specified. And it means that the people who are doing it aren't being careful. And that makes me nervous. And so then there's things in here that I don't believe to be true. Gender identity is each person's sense of being a woman, a man, both, neither, or anywhere along the gender spectrum. I don't know what neither means, because I don't know what the options are if you're not a man or a woman. It's not obvious to me how you can be both, because those are, by definition, binary categories. There's an idea that there's a gender spectrum, but I don't think that that's a valid idea. I don't think there's any evidence for it. Biological sexuality is ancient. It's hundreds of millions of years old. And it's binary because there's two forms of biological sex. Now, of course, this is predicated on the idea that your gender is somehow independent from your biological sex, but that's a proposition, not a fact. And even if it's true, even if it in some manner was determined to be true, it is certainly not determined to be true to that degree now, and certainly not to the degree that it should be instantiated in law. At most, it's an opinion, and I think it's an ill-informed opinion. I think it's a politically motivated and ill-informed opinion. And now it's got the force of law. And then there's another modification, which is gender expression, which is something different than gender identity. So I guess there's biological sex, and then on top of that there's gender identity, which is separate. They're not even correlated, or they don't bear any relationship to one another. I guess one is choice, or it isn't exactly clear. I mean, here's one of the things I find very confusing. It seems to me that the leftist activists have made the claim that, with regards to transsexual individuals, for example, that you can be a man in a woman's body and that's a biological reality, or that you can be a woman in a man's body and that's a biological reality. So as long as your gender identity is opposite to that of your cardinal biological sexual attributes, then that's biologically determined. But if your gender identity is in sync with your biological attributes, then that's a free-floating cultural construct. Unless I've got my logic wrong somehow. And I cannot see how both of those things can possibly be true. But I don't think that coherence is one of the hallmarks of radical, politically correct thinking. And you can tell that because politically correct people, like the people who have produced this legislation, and these policies are capable of saying things like, it is their sense, meaning each person's, by the way, it is their sense of being, maybe an individual can decide to be a plurality as well, and that's why there is being used as the pronoun in this particular sentence. Although I think the real reason is that the person who wrote this can't write. It is their sense of being a woman, a man, both, neither, or anywhere along the gender spectrum. From my perspective, that sentence is entirely nonsensical. And now it's law. And then, okay, so we've got biological sex, we've got gender identity, and then on top of that, we've got gender expression, which I guess is how you express your gender identity, which is separate from your biological sexual orientation. It's the way people publicly present their gender. It is the presentation of gender through such aspects as dress, hair, makeup, body language, and voice. Okay, well, those are canonical categories now, and it isn't clear to me, because of the legislation, it's possible, I believe it's possible, that my commentary on these definitions is now illegal, and that it's also now potentially classifiable as hate speech. And I would say if that's the case, then like, well, it's the sort of thing I'm going to question. And if someone should be put in jail for questioning that, and then questioning that, then I guess I should be put in jail, because I'm going to continue to question it. I think it's nonsensical. I think the formulation is absurd. I think it has no scientific standing. I think it's ideologically motivated. I think it's divisive. I think it's dangerous. It causes chaos. It confuses people. There's no upside to it. And for every one person that this potential transformation of legislation is going to free from oppression, it's going to deathly confuse 100 more. And I say that as a clinician with some experience in this matter. More definitions. The code does not define the grounds of gender identity, gender expression, or sex. Instead, the understanding of these and other related terms and the implications for the code, that's the Ontario Human Rights Code, and Ontario Human Rights Commission policies, is evolving from tribunal and court decisions, social science research, as well as self-identity and common everyday use. More definitions. Sex is the anatomical classification of people as male, female, or intersex, usually assigned at birth. I should also point out that the class of intersex is so rare to be virtually non-existent, and it isn't reasonable to make standard policy on the basis of extreme exceptions. And the reason for that is that there are myriads, millions of extreme exceptions, and it's not possible to constitute a collective society on the basis of legislation that's designed for exceptions. It can't be done. By definition, the law is fundamentally there to produce a collective agreement. Okay, back definitions. Once again, gender identity is each person's internal and individual experience of gender. We've already said that. A person's gender identity may be the same as or different from their birth assigned sex. Well, that's the theory. Gender expression is how a person publicly expresses or presents their gender. Well, we've covered that. There's another addition here. A person's chosen name and pronoun are also common ways of expressing gender. Others perceive a person's gender through those attributes. Well, this is also Ontario Human Rights Commission policy. Okay, so this is the scenario I've been running through my head. I can envision a student or a colleague insisting that I call them using gender-neutral pronouns, je, Z-H-E, or Z-H-E for you Americans, je or je, I think it is. I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. I think it's manipulative. I don't recognize another person's right to determine what pronouns I use to address them. I won't do it. Now, again, I think that because of these new laws, that my decision might be illegal, and maybe it's even a decision of hate, but I'm not doing it. I think that those gender-neutral pronouns are politically motivated. I think they're connected to an entire underground apparatus of political motivations, radical left political motivations. And I think uttering those words makes me a tool of those motivations. And I'm going to try to be a tool of my own motivations as clearly as I can articulate them, and not the mouthpiece of some murderous ideology. A person's gender identity, definitions continued, a person's gender identity is fundamentally different from and not related to their sexual orientation. Well, that's rubbish fundamentally, because if you ran a correlation analysis between gender identity and sexual orientation, the correlation is going to be something like 0.95, which indicates an almost perfect correlation. For the vast majority of people, gender identity and sexual orientation are the same thing. And so it is not fundamentally different from and not related to their sexual orientation. That's just a misstatement of fact. Perhaps for a minority of people, sometimes they're dissociable. But that doesn't mean that a gender identity is fundamentally different from and not related to sexual orientation. It's a complete misstatement of fact. If there's a correlation of any magnitude between two things, then one is related to another. and when the correlation is just about perfect, well, then they are fundamentally related. So that's another policy that's based actually on a lie, a misstatement, an untruth. All right, so trans or transgender is an umbrella term referring to people with diverse gender identities and expressions that differ from stereotypical gender norms. It includes, but is not limited to, people who identify as transgender, trans woman, trans man, transsexual, cross-dressers, or gender non-conforming, gender variant, or gender queer. Now, here's what I think about these terms. You see, the people who use these terms want everyone to believe that they're for all the good things that they say they're for. But I don't believe any of that. I don't think that they're for good things at all. I think that they use the pretense that they're for good things, that they stand for good things, to continue their nefarious activity. And one of the most nefarious elements of their activity is the use of these ideological clubs, and the club basically is, here's the club. I mean the kind of club that you hit people with. If there's a difference in outcome, then it's a consequence of racism and bias. And then if I point out the difference, then I'm a good person. So my little routine for wandering through the world, making sure that I'm a good person, unlike those other people who aren't good people, that need to be punished and perhaps jailed, I look for inequalities, and wherever I find them, I attribute them to racism. And so that means I can spend my whole life doing nothing but being on the side of good by ferreting out all the evil that resides in other people and not in me. I don't trust people like that. I think the continual generation of these terms is a consequence of the desire to make that game continue for as long as possible, regardless of the consequences, so that the people who hold those opinions can always be morally correct and have a whole set of enemies to go after. And that's why the terms keep multiplying, because every time society moves to become more tolerant, more liberal, well, then that interferes with the game, because the game is, well, we have to find racist and horrible people, and so the solution to that is, well, let's just continue to generate categories, more and more categories, to demonstrate how unequal people are. Well, because the categories are infinitely divisible, and we'll get to that later, it's a game that never runs out. And if you're a professional, if you're someone whose profession is to be politically correct or to be a social justice warrior, and that might be an academic, especially a Marxist one, in all sorts of sub-disciplines, we'll also get to that later, like sociology and social work and many of the social sciences apart from those two, and educational psychology, that's another major offender, and social psychology, another major offender, then you're publicly subsidized for your damn viewpoints. And if you can continue to make the case that the world is full of racists and people possessed by ethnic hatred, persecuting the poor minorities, then your shtick lasts forever, and you can fully justify your subsidized position, as well as being on the side of right and morality and making the world a better place. What a good deal for everyone who's politically correct. Definition of discrimination and harassment. Now, these are truly terrifying. Discrimination happens when a person experiences negative treatment or impact, intentional or not, because of their gender identity or gender expression. Okay, and that could be age, sex, race, etc. Okay, think about that sentence. Discrimination happens when a person experiences negative treatment or impact. Okay, so let's say negative impact. Well, so what that means is that if I say something that makes you feel negative emotion, or maybe even interferes with your happiness, because those are actually separate things, then you've experienced negative impact. Okay, now, that's bad enough, because it means that you get to decide when what I've said is not appropriate. But the worst part of it, and that's not so good, because you could misunderstand me, or maybe what I'm saying is right and you just don't like it, or, there's a whole variety of reasons you might get upset about what I say. So the fact that you get upset about something, that's negative impact, but that doesn't necessarily mean that something bad has happened. It might even mean that something's good has happened. I don't think I've ever learned anything in my entire life that wasn't preceded by some kind of negative impact. We always learn things the hard way. But the worst part of it is the next phrase. Discrimination happens when a person experiences negative treatment or impact, intentional or not. Okay, so here, think about this. When you have little children, and maybe one runs into the other and knocks even your child down, you set your child up, and the first thing you say is, well, Bobby didn't mean it. And the reason you say that is because we've learned, and this is painful, this is a painful thing that human beings have learned, it's at the base of our modern legal systems, that intent matters. It isn't consequences that you judge, it's intent. If I accidentally run into you, that's way different than if I run into you on purpose. You know, if I kill you accidentally, that's manslaughter at its worst. If I kill you with intent, that's the worst form of homicide. We judge people on intent, not on consequences. And so this policy is designed to reverse that. It's now possible that you can discriminate against someone and violate the law. And I think maybe even be persecuted for hate crimes, because this is written in such a messy manner, by doing something accidental, intentional or not. Well, who's going to judge that? Well, you can imagine who's going to judge that. The kind of people who would dare to judge that. Harassment. Harassment is a form of discrimination. It can include sexually explicit or other inappropriate comments, not defined, questions, jokes, name-calling, images, email and social media. It doesn't say what email and social media content, just email and social media, which is another indication of the appalling level of literacy behind these statements. Transphobic, homophobic, or other bullying, sexual advances, touching and other unwelcome and ongoing behavior that insults, demeans, harms, or threatens a person in some way. All right, so the first thing you might note is that this has been written to cover the broadest possible range of possibilities. That's the exact opposite of what good legislation does. So if you combine these, discrimination and harassment, the policies basically allow for people to, like, if I unintentionally negatively impact you with a joke, then I'm harassing you, and that's well on its way to being, well, it's a violation of the Ontario Human Rights Code. It's an offence according to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and it's on the way to being a hate crime as far as I can tell with the modifications of federal legislation. So, and then to cap it all off, they throw this in at the end of the sentence. Other unwelcome and ongoing behavior that insults, demeans, harms, or threatens a person in some way. Okay, so that's all pretty scary, but then there's more, of course. And so this is the Ontario Human Rights Commission developing policies on organizational liability. So listen to this. Organizations are liable for any discrimination and harassment that happens. They are also liable for not accommodating a trans person's needs unless it would cause undue hardship. Well, the whole issue of undue hardship is a tricky one, because I'm not exactly sure who adjudicates that. I mean, you know, we'll get to that later. They must deal with complaints, take steps to prevent problems, and provide a safe, welcoming environment for trans people. Okay, and you know, old people and ethnically diverse people, and you know, differently gendered people, and all of that. So, fine. Organizations are liable for any discrimination and harassment that happens. Okay, well, that puts a hell of an onus on the organization, because it isn't exactly clear to me how organizations are going to monitor all of their people all of the time in the organizations. What if they're using social media outside the organization? So organizations are now liable for all of this. So how are you going to police all that? Okay, next. More on liability. From the Ontario Human Rights Code. Under Section 46.3 of the Code, a corporation, trade union, or occupational association, unincorporated association, or employees organization, now listen to this, will be held responsible for discrimination, including acts or omissions committed by employees or agents in the course of their employment. This is known as vicarious liability. Okay. Responsible parties violate the code. Now this is where it gets horrible, I think. Where they directly or indirectly intentionally or unintentionally infringe the code, or whether they otherwise authorize, condone, or adopt behavior that is contrary to the code. It is unacceptable to choose to remain unaware, ignore, or fail to address potential or actual human rights violations, whether or not a complaint is made. God, you couldn't possibly design a broader definition of liability. Potential or actual human rights violations, whether or not a complaint is made. Okay, so does that means that you have vicarious liability if you fail to address a potential human rights violation, whether or not a complaint is made. The only thing I can say about legislation that's written in this manner is that it seems to me to be consciously designed to get as many people in trouble as possible. That's it. It's designed to get as many people as possible in trouble at the same time. So that brings us to the end of part 1 of this talk on political correctness. In it, I described the increasing fear that's spread by politically correct activism throughout large organizations, including academic institutions like the University of Toronto. I also discussed the increasing all-pervasiveness of this viewpoint because it's not something that's localized anymore to academic institutions. It's spread beyond them and is characteristic of the preoccupations of a certain kind of administrator at a very large multitude of large organizations. And I described in detail the Canadian Bill C-16, which is an attempt to modify the Canadian Human Rights Code and the Criminal Code to make a whole variety of speech acts and the holding of certain opinions or the articulating of them criminal, and maybe even criminal under the provisions of the hate crime legislation. In part 2, I'm going to give you a more detailed analysis of the University of Toronto's attempts to transform its HR department into a politically correct organization. I'm using the goals of the University of Toronto as a cautionary tale about how such political maneuvers operate at a local level. Again, on the principle that a good story about something local is a good story about something with general significance. In part 3, I'm going to talk about what individuals can do about these sorts of things, what you as a citizen, how you as a citizen might arm yourself intellectually so that you can articulate a stance against this kind of movement if you feel that that's in your best interests. Thanks for listening. If you want to support endeavors such as these, please visit my Patreon site, which allows you to do so. It's a monthly subscription site that helps me develop these videos and continue my work on them. And who knows, if things keep up the way they are, maybe it'll be my only source of income after it becomes impossible for me to work at a university and say what I want to say. If you want to provide such support, just Google Patreon Jordan Peterson. Thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you very soon.
When reviewing the responses of several colleagues, Professor Peterson comes across a particularly chilling statement. Quote, "The personal consequences of objecting to this madness, this gender dysphoria madness, are huge. The effect of my objection on society is minuscule. The risk isn't worth it. We should have done something about this 10 years ago. Gee, you think? For years, the powers that be at the college level have capitulated to an entire generation of directionless, weak-minded, fragile snowflakes who haven't even the mental courage or willpower to simply ignore things they don't agree with. The inmates are running the asylum and professors are running for their careers. Remember that Klingon term, ladies and gentlemen? Marry up! Enough! If you are one of these non-binary robots and aren't intellectually mature enough to get your feelings hurt and still go on breathing, stop now. It's about to get, well, in the words of Martin Lawrence,
shit just got real.
First off, stop making up complicated words to explain simple concepts. You are not a better person because you take twice as long to describe what a male is. There is no such thing as a cis male or a cis female. You are male or you're female, period. You have chromosomes. If you have an X and a Y chromosome, guess what? You're a guy. If you have two X chromosomes, you're a gal. That's it. It doesn't go any further than that. It's genetic. It is science. It is reality. If you think you're not the gender of your genitals and your DNA, you have an issue of the mind and the heart, not your genes, not your DNA, not your biology. But what you feel might be seem very real to you, but it's not. It's self-delusion. It is not, nor will it ever be reflected in your biology. I can't believe this even needs to be said out loud. Professor Peterson is right to reject this ridiculous, indulgent fad. Not only is it unnecessarily time-consuming, it's dangerous. Although this is a relatively new social phenomenon, educational institutions across the country are caving to social stigma rather than upholding the honored traditions of higher education. It is, in a word, madness. Cuckoo! This is a flimsy house of cards, and it's set to tumble down around our heads at any moment. Consider this. Consider this, ladies and gentlemen. If there is no gender, then there's no such thing as transgender, right? No such thing as women's rights. For women aren't really women, just the misguided entities of antiquated social norms, societal norms. If sexuality is fluid, then there is no such thing as being homosexual. There are no gay rights as a consequence. There are no straight people. GLAAD can put out the closed for business sign. It's been 3 decades of futility. I mean, why are we making such a fuss over the first woman presidential candidate if her gender isn't a real concept? Under this line of reasoning, Hillary Clinton hasn't broken any glass ceilings. So much for herstory. Throughout the millennium, men have told women how to dress, what to strive for, and what to do with their bodies. Modern feminism has been the direct rebellion against patriarchy. Just as women are gaining equal ground in the marketplace and in education, here come men again. Well, cis men, perhaps. This time to tell women that they don't have the right to define womanhood anymore. A man can claim, or a cis man, or whatever the hell, can claim that mantle simply by announcing it to the world. Womanhood once again takes a back seat to the fancies of cis men, or whatever the hell. If I were to say that we should be teaching in schools that all life originated from alien origin, we would first have to present a very lengthy, extensive scientific case for such a thing. A case based on the scientific method. Of course, making such a case would not be part of the left-wing narrative, hence why you would be required to prove it. Anything that is consistent with the left-wing narrative, you don't have to prove a damn thing. like evolution, for example. There is no science behind non-binary gender theory. Theories actually have evidence behind them. I think the term they're looking for here is hypotheses. And hypotheses is just imagination, brainstorming. A theory actually has some evidence behind it. So there is no science behind non-binary gender hypotheses, and yet it is being forced into our schools, our workplaces, and the public square. In other words, our schools, workplaces, and the public square is being intellectually raped without a second thought about the consequences of such a rash, recent movement. People like Jordan Peterson are calling on all rational adults, if there still are any in this country, to pump the brakes on this whole thing before we all go hurtling towards a fate we can't come back from. And not just tamping on the brakes a bit, I'm talking about standing on those mothers. We could at least wait for some credible data to come in, which I wish there will never be any. I mean, God, Genesis chapter 2, in God's image he made them, male and female, he created them. Before we start suing people for using the wrong gender pronoun, and how could anybody remember 58 of them in the first place? I mean, we are changing public policy, education, and the very structure of civilized society, in other words, making it uncivilized, to accommodate an unscientific modern trend demanded and perpetuated by children, literal children, and adults who never grew up. Donald Trump is an example of that. The barely voting age bullies at institutions like Peterson's have not lived long enough to participate in adult society. You know that expression about an adult, well, a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality, and the older you get, the more conservative you get because you have more of a stake in the existing system. They are not qualified to be deciding for the rest of us that the sky isn't blue. Most of them have never paid a bill or been responsible for another human being's life in their lives. We have let their still developing, non-developing brains wrest unthinkable control over the livelihood of teachers like Peterson and the penalties for hurting a person's feelings. Whoa, 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 feelings. There is no nobility in intolerance, even if you think you're on the right side of it. I never imagined there would be a day when a grown woman or man would have to carry such fear simply for referring to other grown men and women as he, she, Mr., Miss, or even Ms. Discrimination has made way for tolerance. Oh no, it didn't make way for it. The left defined something as discrimination. The left gets to make all the social definitions, of course. And they made the way for tolerance of evil. Tolerance has made way for acceptance. Acceptance has made way for imposition, mandatory, no choice. Now it's being forced on us. And I mean, they fought for tolerance. They said we must be more tolerant because they wanted their views to replace ours. The first step in getting there, in replacing a social norm, a social mores, is to say, no, you need to tolerate my alternative view. And then once you get, an even playing field, well, then they just keep pushing until their view is the only one tolerated by law. As we'll see. In the next segment, courtesy of Dave Leach of the StridentConservative.com, it's finally happened, ladies and gentlemen. Remember Sweet Cakes by Melissa, the Christian bakery down in Oregon, run by a Christian family that have been under fierce and ferocious persecution by the left-wing nut pagans who run that particular state? Well, they've finally been driven out of business for good. Sweet Cakes by Melissa no longer exists. In 2013, years before the Obergefell versus Hodges Supreme Court decision that made Sodom marriage the so-called loved land, a small Congress is supposed to do that. That's what the Constitution says. A small family-owned and operated bakery in Oregon refused to bake a wedding cake, for a lesbian wedding because it was a violation of their constitutional right to exercise their freedom of religion. Even though the Oregon law they allegedly violated, the Oregon Equality Act of 2007, which is blatantly unconstitutional, contained exemptions for religious organizations and schools. When it came to sexual orientation issues, the state did not consider religion to be relevant when it comes to Christian-owned businesses. After being fined $135,000 by the state of Oregon and receiving numerous protests and death threats, Sweet Cakes by Melissa is now officially closed for good. Efforts to survive as Aaron and Melissa Klein fought to have their right to religious freedom restored. Remember when we thought our constitutional rights were unalienable or inalienable? Good times, good times. Their fight, their struggle against this ferocious persecution has been long and difficult. They closed the doors to their storefront location 3 years ago and moved the business to their home in order to no longer be a place of public accommodation. But that wasn't enough for the state of Oregon. They started a GoFundMe crowdfunding campaign to raise money in order to pay their fine. But GoFundMe said, "Go F you," shutting it down, claiming that it violated company policy. And last December, just before Christmas, bastards, the state of Oregon seized every penny of their personal funds. Every penny. They robbed the Kleins. They totally victimized the Kleins. They may as well have taken the Kleins out and shot them in the back of the head 4 times. Seized every penny that they're destitute. Absolutely destitute. I personally have been out of work for 3 years. I still have, we still have our nest egg, and it's not insubstantial. This is like if the asshole who fired me 3 years ago had not only taken away my income, but had stolen all my savings too. And we would absolutely destitute, not a penny to our names. That's what's happened to the Kleins. Why? Because they stood on their inalienable right to free exercise of religion as guaranteed in the First Amendment. And obviously the First Amendment does not apply in the state of Oregon. Despite these valiant efforts, and with the business completely destroyed, the Klein family was literally run out of business by the anti-Christian, Christophobic, pro-homosexual Gestapo. If you want to know why I call them that, well, here you go. In the Obergefell versus Hodges decision, Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote in his majority opinion that the religious doctrines of those who objected to Sodom marriage would be protected. Yeah, this is protection, I guess. Here's a quote from that opinion. It must be emphasized that religions, and by which he means Islam, and those who adhere to religious doctrines may continue to advocate with utmost sincere conviction that by divine precepts, Sodom marriage should not be condoned. The First Amendment ensures, except in Oregon, that religious organizations and persons are given proper protection as they seek to teach the principles that are so fulfilling and so central to their lives and faiths, and to their own deep aspirations to continue the family structure they have long revered. Makes you wonder what planet Anthony Kennedy was living on. As Chief Justice John Roberts countered when he wrote for the minority, Kennedy used the word advocate to describe, in law, and this is how you can tell that Hillary Clinton is a lawyer. In law, language is the weapon. If you're a warrior in a courtroom, language is your weapon. And Justice Kennedy used the word advocate to describe our First Amendment religious rights, while the Constitution, the First Amendment, uses the word exercise, which is a broader term. Advocation is advocacy is a form of exercise, but exercise encompasses more than just advocacy. It includes living it in and throughout your life. Many good and decent people, Chief Justice Roberts wrote, oppose Sodom marriage as a tenet of faith, and their freedom to exercise religion, not just advocate, exercise their religion, is, unlike the right imagined by the majority, actually spelled out in the Constitution. You still think the Constitution exists as a practical matter? Not even close, ladies and gentlemen. Though the complaint in Oregon preceded the Supreme Court decision, the difference spoken of by Roberts is evident in the case. And unfortunately, it means that cases such as Sweet Cakes by Melissa will no longer be an aberration. This has been documented many times. The agenda of the Gestapo has nothing to do with equal rights. It's about domination. Their primary objective is the complete and utter annihilation of morality and Christianity in America. And in the end, the constitutional rights of every American, which we no longer have, unless we conform and assimilate to the left. And now that's invaded the Republican Party too, with Trump mania. And for those who read this and claim that I'm nothing more than a scaremongering right-wing extremist, blah, 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 consider this quote from Masha Gessen, a lesbian extremist, about the real goal of the homosexual movement. Quote, "The institution of marriage is going to change. And it should change." Now, change, not expand, change. There was somebody on the old CompuServe Information Service, a homosexual poster, who would go on endlessly about how homosexuality needs to replace heterosexuality. Heterosexuality is what needs to be banned. That's what he said. 20 years later, it's happening. Resuming the quote from Masha Gessen, And again, I don't think it should exist. I have 3 kids who have 5 parents. Oh, don't you feel sorry for those kids? More or less? She doesn't even know. And I don't see why they shouldn't have 5 parents legally. This is straight out of Time Enough for Love by Robert Heinlein. I mean, this is a perverted fertility cult mentality. I met my new partner, and she had just had a baby, and that baby's biological father is my brother, and my daughter's biological father is a man who lives in Russia, and my adopted son also considers him his father. So the 5 parents break down into 2 groups of 3, which doesn't even add up to 5. Jesus. And really, talk now. Here is something that needs to be binary as well. And really, I would like to live in a legal system that is capable of reflecting that reality, and I don't think that's compatible with the institution of marriage. So here it is. Destroy what God ordained. There's a reason why God ordained a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the 2 shall become one flesh. That's the base. Marriage is the basis of the family unit. Marriage is the basis of the family. Family is the basis of society. If you throw out that foundation, guess what happens to society? It disappears. It collapses. You could make the argument that it's species suicide. Or how about this little tidbit from the article, Gay Power versus Religious Liberty? Quote, the legal struggle for queer rights, their term, they used it, I didn't insert that, no pun intended, in there. The legal struggle for queer rights will one day be a struggle between freedom of religion versus sexual orientation. So said Canadian lesbian lawyer Barbara Finley, quoted by columnists John Leo and Janet Folger in The Criminalization of Christianity. And behind all of this, ultimately, is Satan. Just like in the days of Noah. And you remember what God did then. I mean, maybe he just directly caused the waters to gush from the Earth's mantle, and maybe it was a comet strike. Well, who knows? I mean, but God destroyed all life on the planet except for the animals in the ark and Noah's family. Why? Because as it says right there in Genesis chapter, I think it's chapter 6, men's thoughts were only evil continually, and he was sorry he had ever made mankind, humanity. How about this from the Obama regime itself? Quote, the zero-sum game is how homosexual extremist law professor and Obama Equal Opportunity Employment Commission appointee Chai Feldblum describes the legal battles between modern rights based on homosexual orientation, read behavior, because it's not an inherent trait. You're not born that way. And the traditional American principle of religious liberty. Gays win, Christians lose, Feldblum said, predicting homosexuals would win all the legal contests and Christianity would be banned. He didn't say that part, but that's the end game of this. If you read the book of Revelation, ultimately the Christians the church will be raptured. So if you're a believer in Jesus Christ right now, you won't see the tribulation. That's not saying things aren't going to get worse and worse and worse before the tribulation. But ultimately, Christians will be, it'll be genocide. Tribulation age Christians, those who accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior after the rapture, will be subjected to genocide. They will be slaughtered en masse by the millions and millions and millions for not conforming to these satanic directives. From homosexual, or from sodomarriage to the gender dysphoria hysteria currently consuming the nation, the gay Stapo thugs working on behalf of the LGBT radicals, consisting of government, public schools, and politically correct businesses, are armed to the teeth and stand ready to advance to steamroll their pro-homosexual, anti-Christian, anti-American agenda right over the top of us. And it's not just a question of standing ready. They're already doing it. Our constitutional rights are not slipping away day by day. They are already gone. Just ask the Kleins. Unfortunately, too many in today's church are too ignorant and indifferent to care, let alone do anything to stop it. And that's the biggest tragedy of all, because we can't stop it. It's too late. Bend over or die.